Alright, hello everybody. I'm just going to do this quick little video for flowcharting. For those of you who've never done flowcharting before, which is probably the majority of you, I just wanted to kind of outline the idea of what a flowchart is so that you all have a very good idea of what it is that you're going to be doing moving forward with the flowcharting exercise. So you see this note in your e-learning course, and I just wanted to quickly go over some of the ideas associated with that. So flowcharting is basically a way to plan out a program. It's a way to visually look at a program and plan that program out on paper or in a flowcharting piece of software, or even in Microsoft Word or some other type of desktop publishing application. So flowcharting is the ability to actually break the problem down into its smaller parts and then be able to actually take that flowchart when you're completed, knowing where you're going to go from one spot to the next, and then using that as your guide when you're programming your assignments and your different software. So I'm going to start with looking at all the different symbols and what they mean. So an oval is both the start and the stop of a program. So you can see here it looks like an oval. The oval is the start and the stop. It indicates the start or end of a program's flow, and there can only be one start oval and one end oval. So you can only ever have that on a flowchart. So there should only ever be one start and one stop, and we'll talk later about how that plays out. After that, probably the most important part of any flowchart is the arrow, and that indicates the flow line. So that shows how the flow is going to go from left to right, so or up and down. So it just gives you the idea, if you're looking at the flowchart, of which direction the program is flowing. So am I going from this step to this step, or am I going the opposite way? So that arrow is really important because it tells the person looking at the flowchart which direction your overall chart is moving in. Next is the rectangle, and a rectangle is put in place in order to indicate a process. So a process is something that is done like a calculation or some sort of action that the computer has to do. Something where the computer is actually doing some kind of a mathematical calculation or an internal process that happens using a rectangle. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The parallelogram is the input and output. So this is an important one, and you see this a lot in flow diagrams, and that is when the user has to input something into the computer, or when the computer is actually displaying something on the screen or outputting to a printer or something to that effect, you would use a parallelogram. So if you need that user to enter a value, then generally speaking you're going to be using the parallelogram. The circle is an on-page connector. A lot of the time when you're drawing flow diagrams, you're going to notice that you're going to get to the bottom of the screen and you're not going to have enough room to continue the diagram. So the circle is an on-page connector that allows you to continue the flow chart on the same page but somewhere else on the page. That's useful for two reasons. Number one, if you get to the bottom of the page and you have to continue the flow diagram, it's nice to be able to go back to the top, put a circle in at the top, and then continue your flow diagram. The other reason that's really good is that you can use these circles to kind of join back into your program at different points. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on when we look at our example as well. This upside down pentagon, or what I call the home plate, is our off-page connector. So anytime you have multiple pages that you have to use in order to do your flow diagram, you can use this upside down pentagon, put a number inside of it, and then on your next page, when you're doing more of your flow diagram, you're going to then use that to start the next page, start the flow on the next page. The diamond here, it's a really important one, and it's the only shape in a flow diagram that is allowed to have two arrows coming out of it. And that's because it represents a decision. Either your program is going to go one way or it's going to go another way. So the diamond is an important aspect of programming because it represents that decision-making process as to what the computer is going to do based on some sort of input. The very last one that we won't use very much is the hexagon, which indicates a procedure. And usually the hexagon is only used when you've got a very large program and you've created a procedure that you're going to go back to. It is useful definitely when you start getting into much larger programs, but for the purposes of our course, we don't really need that. Okay, so let's look really quickly at an example of this. So let's say that we had a really simple program. The program is the computer generates a random number between 1 and 10. The user guesses the number. If they get it right, yay. If they get it wrong, sorry, and the game ends. Okay? So simple. User enters random number is generated by the computer. The user enters a number as a guess. If the guess is correct, the computer puts a congratulation message up and says hooray. If the guess is incorrect, the computer says sorry, you're wrong, and exits the game. Okay, so let's look at that. Okay, so let's take a look at an example. So anytime we try to start a program, we have to have a start. So as we remember from our first one, that is an oval. Okay, so an oval is going to be the start of the program. So we're going to put an oval in here, and we're going to write, inside the oval, we're going to write start. And then we have to have a flow arrow. So we have a flow arrow going to our next thing. Now remember what the program is. The computer generates a random number, the user enters a guess, and then the computer makes a decision as to whether that guess is correct or not. If it's correct, it says congratulations. If it's not correct, then it ends the game. So the next step is the computer generating a random number. Well, anytime the computer has to perform some kind of a process, remember that's a rectangle. Okay, so our next thing is a rectangle. So, and that is generate random number. Okay, so we're generating a random number. The next thing that the computer has to do is then the computer's generated this random number. The next thing it's got to do is it's got to tell the user to enter a guess. So we have to have a parallelogram here. That's an input or an output, and we're going to be prompting. Okay, so we're going to prompt for a number from 1 to 10. Once that prompt is up, then we can have another input where the user inputs their guess. After the user has entered their guess, we then have to go down and we have to get into our decision making. So the user has entered their guess, there's a random number generated, there's a prompt, the user has input their guess. Once that guess is in, the computer has to determine whether the random is equal to the guess. If the answer to that is yes, we put an arrow with a yes. You can just put Y, but sometimes I put yes there. If they have guessed the right number and the guess is equal to the random number, then there's an output. Remember, that's a parallelogram with some sort of congrats message. And then, if it's no, okay, we have to go to something else. So what we would normally do is we would normally create an on-page connector here because I'm at the bottom of my page and I've got nowhere to go. So I'm going to put a circle. It's not a very good circle, I know, but that's what it is. I put a 1 there, and then I put another circle at the top of my page or wherever else I want to start that, and I put a 1 into that. So now I know that when I'm going down this list and I'm following along, I can go back to my 1, and I know that now my 1 continues. So if the user has not got it right, then the computer has to output a message. That message says, sorry, incorrect. Okay. And then, as we said, after the sorry, incorrect, we also have to end the game. Now, the only way to end the game is, again, through an oval. Remember I said there are 2 ovals in every program, one for the start of the program and one for the end of the program. But we're not quite done there, and that is because this congratulations message also has to lead to an end game. So what needs to happen here is we need to go to a second on-page connector. So we do a circle here, we put a number 2 in it, and then we put a number 2 over here, circle around it, and it goes to the flow line. Now here's one of the important things. You cannot put 2 arrows into any one of the flowchart symbols. You can only put 1 line in. So when we want to do something like this where we're putting a second entrance into the end, we put the 2 there with an on-page connector and we simply draw the line. As you can see here, we draw that line so that you kind of know right here that that on-page connector is, this on-page connector from 2 goes into the flow line right here. You can't have more than one flow line going into an end. You also can't have, like here, you can't have more than one flow line coming out of a start. As we said before, there's always one input and one output, but when we get down below, the only exception is this decision structure. And in this decision structure, now we have both a yes and a no, and we have to branch off from there. Now this is a pretty simple program, but it hopefully gives you an idea of what a regular program looks like as far as a flowchart is concerned.